I know it's a contract question, so right away I talk about the governing law. Boom. I'll bold stuff as I'm addressing it over here. Next, let's start reading. Brian, owner of a commercial bakery, and Sam, owner of a bakery supply business, met for the first time and discussed Brian's inability to find a reliable source of maple topping. Okay, so the second I read that, I know that I have some merchants, so I throw this down. That's very low-hanging fruit. Next, I keep reading. When Sam told Brian he could supply the maple topping, they orally agreed that Sam would immediately ship 500 gallons at $20 per gallon. In the back of my mind, I do a little math right here, and I know that this is oral, and this right here clearly is going to be over $500, so we're going to have some sort of a statute of fraud issue, but I don't put that quite down yet, but I already filed that away. Also, I noticed that here we're talking about shipping something, and here the shipping cost on this is not going to be tiny. 500 gallons of something, it's going to be somewhat hefty. So I put down that I'm going to talk about the predominant purpose of the contract. Notice that here, however, I did put this underscore denoting that that really is an extra issue to try to differentiate myself from the pack. If this got left out, it would be totally fine because that right there doesn't really answer this question. Next, we continue. They orally agreed, so I put down that there's an oral agreement. Again, at this point, I'm not trying to decipher what the oral agreement is or anything of that nature. Sam then added that he did not want to ship without something in writing, and Brian replied, I will send a written confirmation tomorrow. A few things stick out here. The first thing that sticks out is that this right here, the word added. Sam added. So basically here, the agreement has already been formed. And here, Sam is trying to modify that agreement. And what's he trying to modify by? Well, he wants this additional thing that must happen before a ship. So in a nutshell, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, here we're going to have a modification because this is being added. In addition to that, however, that modification is going to be a condition precedent. So I didn't want to spend a whole lot of time breaking those up quite yet. So really, I just put down Sam's request for written confirmation. And this one, I didn't downgrade, nor did I make super important that way. I just kind of left it in the middle. It needs to be addressed, but it needs to be addressed with enough detail, but it doesn't need to really when I'm looking at a fact pattern, I tend to put stuff in terms of high analysis, low analysis, medium level of analysis. So this one, I'm middle of the road. Next, I deal with this 500 gallons at $20 a gallon and this oral. So I put down that we're going to have some sort of statute of frauds issue. And the second we put the statute of frauds, this is one of the few places where I have kind of a template in my mind. Typically, I know some people like to have complete templates in their mind that you just put down. I tend not to do that because I think sometimes that sounds mechanic. But when it comes to the statute of frauds, typically I think the second you put that down, you automatically put down, is it applicable and have you satisfied? So with that said, now we're on to the next paragraph. For the next 3 weeks, Brian was busy negotiating a conference center catering contract and forgot to send Sam the confirmation information. Okay. The catering contract obligated Brian to provide large quantities of pastries with maple topping. Not really concerned at this point. Brian then recalled his promise to Sam and sent him a purchase order on his standard form for 5,000 gallons of maple topping at $20 a gallon to be delivered to Brian's place of business in 2 weeks. Here, I immediately think to myself, this is going to take some time to explain. So here I then put down my little asterisk. And the reason that I'm doing that, a few things get flagged to me. A, we have the standard order form being sent, right? So the standard order form between commercial merchants where we have different terms. Here we have 5,000 versus here we have 500. So we're going to have some sort of 2207 issue likely, but I'm not quite sure yet. And I don't really want to dig down at this point. That would bog me down. So really what I put down at this point is there's going to be this purchase order that we need to deal with, and we need to know what the impact is. The impact of that clearly is going to be dependent on what we determined the agreement that they created over here. I also notice here that here this says 5,000 gallons, this says 500 gallons, and we're dealing with a purchase order after the statute of frauds. So most likely one of the parties is going to use that as some sort of confirmatory memo. That's my gut feeling at this point, but I don't want to spend time deciphering that quite yet. And if that's the case, then the terms of this purchase order have to match the oral agreement. So now I come back over here and basically, in terms of important, we need to know the terms of the oral agreement. We need the terms, which we have from up here. I just don't want to fill them out right now. And we're also going to need some sort of formation, right? And here, sometimes I've seen people that they get programmed like little robots that whenever they see formation, they do this very methodical. A contract needs an offer, acceptance, consideration. An offer is a manifestation of contractual intent with certain definite terms, etc. We all know those definitions, right? Here I decided my formation, if I go in that direction and I have this very meticulous formation analysis, I'm not going to have time. So I'm actually going to downgrade that. I need to say that the contract was formed and I need to detail what terms those have, but I can't spend that time there because I need to really spend it down here. So let's go ahead and continue. At this point, really, I'm not deciphering anything quite yet in terms of the analysis that needs to go into making these claims. Continue. Sam received the purchase order, but did not notice the change in gallonage. Okay. He saw the delivery date, but in light of Brian's delay in sending the confirmation, he did not believe it was firm. Okay. So this right here, I start to think if he's talking about what somebody believes and they're inside of a contractual relationship, this is going to go to some sort of objective manifestation issue. In this case, I put down objective manifestation, but I deal with it middle of the road, not really an important, well, not unimportant, but certainly not as important as these other things. The same day, Sam sent a signed acknowledgement restating Brian's purchase order. So this right here, now we have the purchase order being sent. Now it's being acknowledged and it's mirroring what was sent to the party on the original purchase form. So that's going to be important. So that I put down that we're going to deal with over here. My gut feeling at this point without writing is that somehow this is going to fail somehow sitting up here. And most likely this purchase order and sign acknowledgement probably are going to create a contract, or at least a valid one. And the second we do this, right, we have a purchase order that wasn't signed by both, and we're still exchanging stuff that's $500 or more. We still need to deal with the statute of frauds again a second time, but this time it's a statute of frauds as it pertains to the purchase order and the acknowledgement, right? Because this purchase order and the signed acknowledgement, assuming that this is a offer and this becomes an acceptance, then that's going to be driven by its own set of terms, not what happened up here, right? So with that said, we deal with that in a little bit more detail. We also notice that they have different terms, right? And one is acknowledged and the other isn't. Here, then we immediately think to, or at least I immediately thought this is going to be a UCC 2207 issue. And I thought, well, this would be a good place to pick up a few extra points in terms of stating what the common law rule is and then immediately going to the UCC, right? So always driving the point home of the rule is this way in the common law, but the UCC is more flexible, driving that over and over and over. And that's basically why we have this here. This is to deal with the fact that in one case, the form is coming in asking for 5,000 gallons, and then the other party's asking for different sets of terms. So that's how we're going to deal with that here, right? Then what we're going to do is, once we have that information down, then we can actually determine what the terms are. So if you look at the question, it says, is there an enforceable contract? We should be able to answer that sitting up here. But we need to point blank, not leave it buried someplace. We need to deal with what are the terms, right? And which makes sense, right? If you're going to have some sort of 2207 issue, then at the end of the day, Some of those terms might be knocked out. Some of it might be what was on the acceptance end, might be what was on the offer end, if it was stated as a take it or leave it offer. But we still need to go through all of the analysis here. As I'm looking at this, and I see that we have Sam talking about what he believed was his subjective belief, and he's acting on those subjective beliefs, then I start to think to myself, well, it also would be nice to talk about any type of defenses, right? There are many defenses to a contract. I only dealt with the ones that are most likely here. So I talked about mistake. Really, I didn't see any place where there's any type of misrepresentation, anything with infant, anything like that. So I go straight for, let's go ahead and talk about potentially having some sort of mistake defense within there. Notice that I minimize the importance of these because without these, if these had to go, if I was short on time, I can still answer what the terms are, right? Which is what it's asking for, right? It's asking me, is there a contract? And if so, what are the terms, right? But the only real defense that most likely is going to trigger anything is the statute of frauds. These right here most likely will not. But we still address them for completeness sake. Next, I look at that and I think to myself, okay, we can start writing. And when I was on the bar, what I did next was I briefly looked at question number 2 so I could determine how much time I needed to save. Then I went back and I started to write it. My gut feeling was question 2 should take shorter because there's a whole lot of meat in here. Upon his return, Sam shipped 500 gallons of maple topping to Brian. In the back of my mind, I'm thinking that could be some sort of partial. First, it's non-conforming, right? It's a UCC contract. The perfect tender rule says that we need to ship perfect goods. We need to deliver conforming goods, right? So we didn't deliver perfect goods, perfect timing. That's not the case here. That's in the back of my mind, but I'm not really addressing that. By that time, Brian was in default with a catering contract due to lack of maple topping. Here, I'm thinking this is going to be some sort of consequential damages discussion. Brian had tried, but had been unable to reach Sam while he was on vacation. Brian had been unsuccessful in obtaining an alternate source of the maple topping. The conference center canceled his contract and resulted in $100,000 worth of lost profits. Most likely a claim for consequential damages, right? So right away, I think to myself, this question will be pretty straightforward. This over here, we have a lot of discussion in terms of interweaving many issues that need to be analyzed carefully. But this one is straightforward. We're going to have a contract, which we're going to get out of here somehow. There's going to be some sort of breach because Sam shipped goods that did not conform to the perfect tender rule. And then we just do our standard damages discussion and, well, expectation damages, right? So we do expectation damages first, incidental damages, consequential damages. Based on what we read here, there would be the ability to get expectation damages, the ability to get incidental damages, but certainly not consequential damages. There's nothing in here to say that the parties had contemplated what would happen in that case. But I could see very strong claims by Brian. Finally, we're going to have some sort of a duty to mitigate. Brian refused the delivery of the maple top and sued for breach, seeking $100,000 in lost profits. I saved 10 to 15 minutes for this. And then this right here, I knew that I would need to spend some time on, but I started with the low-hanging issues. I am going to get rid of this highlighting. The easiest way to do this. And now let's look at what I wrote. Enforceable contract. Question number 1. Governing law. Contracts for the sale of goods are governed by the UCC. This is true regardless of whether the contract is between merchants. All other contracts, including contracts for personal services, are governed by the common law. So this from here to here, in terms of our analysis, we deliver it down here. For the sake of time, I actually wrote this a little bit IRAC-like, but not strict IRAC, right? I mean, I could have done governing law and then just had just this, and then in a separate IRAC, I could have then talked about if it had a mixed purpose. Here, I decided to throw both issues together, but to make them kind of IRAC-like, I make sure that I followed the same order, right? First, here's the rule for whether or not it's a UCC or common law. Here's the analysis, and here, whether or not the predominant purpose, and then here, reaching the conclusion on that. Notice that in this particular case, really the analysis is almost non-existent. It's just tagging it, right? Sam and Brian. Here, you look at it. Sam and Brian are attempting to contract for the sale of maple topping, which is a good. The agreement also involves the shipping. So in this particular instance, they are contracting for the sale of goods. That fits that rule. We're done, right? We don't need to go into any more analysis on that. Here, again, this was optional if it has a mixed purpose. And then over here, we basically say one could, the argument, in theory, the contract be construed as a service, the shipping, but the purpose was clearly the sale of the toppings and the delivery just incidental. Then we conclude that's the UCC governs. While I'm doing this in the back of my mind, I am deciphering what's happening with those high important areas, not in a distracting way. Okay, next, low-hanging fruit merchants, right? Brian, commercial bakery. Sam, bakery supply. Boom. We start out by saying why we're going to differentiate whether or not they're merchants or not, right? Some of the terms in the UCC vary depending on whether or not one or both of the contract parties are merchants. A party is a merchant if they are a professional seller of the goods in question or if they are a commercial entity engaged in the purchase of goods. Nice short rule. Notice that this rule is not all-encompassing. It is possible to be a merchant in a different way. You could be an expert in something and not purchase it or sell it. The analysis, again, is what I consider just tagging, right? It's just, hey, I found a fact to support that. So Brian is the owner of a commercial bakery. He's purchasing maple topping. Thus, he is a merchant with regards over the sale of the topping. Notice that he's a merchant, but it's only with regards of the topping. We do the same thing with Sam. Again, it's just tagging it. Sam is the owner for bakery supply business, and thus he is a merchant in maple topping. And then we conclude this contract is between two merchants. Notice here, I probably could have got a few more points had I followed up this sentence with one more, which is because this is a contract between merchants, a higher degree of good faith is expected. For the sake of time, we left that out. If we go back to our outline, when I wrote this, notice this formation issue, I downgraded, but I need the terms. So what I actually wrote when I was on the bar exam was here. This right here, I didn't write until later. So we are actually going to downgrade this for now. I'll mark it red. We'll come back to it. When I was actually on the bar and the clock is running and I'm sweating bullets trying to get through all of this, I did not write. Why? I could have easily said the fact states that Brian and Sam reached an oral agreement. Thus, it is presumed that there was an offer and acceptance. And I could have added that. It is presumed that there was an offer, acceptance, and valid consideration. Boom. And then continue. However, later on, when I'm talking about the Statute of Frauds, the way to satisfy the Statute of Frauds with a confirmatory memo is that the terms here in that memo have to match the terms of the oral contract. I needed to somehow establish that. I knew this early on. Again, that's me thinking ahead, but at the same time working on this. Here's what I continued. Thus, it is presumed that there was an offer and acceptance. The material terms are present. So in this case, we're going to go over what the material terms are within a UCC contract, which, as you know, is subject matter, parties, and quantity. So 500 gallons of the topping. So we have the quantity, we have the subject matter. 500 is the quantity and the goods. So here I indicate very clearly that those are what we're going to need for a UCC contract. Brian and Sam are the parties, right? Now, one thing to note is that even though that's the minimum set of material terms for a UCC contract, the other terms that are in the contract actually come in as well. So we then include those as well. There are also other terms, such as the immediate shipment. So it needs to be shipped immediately, as it stocks here, and a contract price of $20 per gallon. And there was bargain for consideration. So we need to establish that too. I didn't go into a lot of detail very quickly. Sam is giving up the product and Brian is giving up money. Thus, at this point, there was a legally binding contract for the sale of the goods on those terms. Now, if I wanted to, I could have done the Statute of Frauds analysis up here. However, I decided to first establish that a contract form and then made the contract voidable because it defends applies. And that defense happens to be the statute of frauds. If we leave this off right here, we have a problem. So thus, at this point, there's a legal binding contract for the sale of goods on those terms. That makes sense, unless a defense applies. Statute of frauds is a defense. Moving next, we have Sam. So everything that we've done so far is from the first paragraph. So next, we're dealing with Sam sitting up here. Sam then added, this is a modification that he wants to do. And that modification, what he wants to do is he's asking for a written confirmation, and he doesn't want to ship. He doesn't want his obligations to be triggered unless that happens. So here, when I first encountered this, I scratched my head a little bit in terms of how to organize it. We have for sure contract modification. Number two, we have a set of merchants. So under the UCC, we know that merchants can modify a contract just needing only good faith. And we also have the fact the modification that he wants is a condition precedent. So we could separate the condition precedent, that is, unless the writing arrives, then you don't have to ship. We can also separate out the modification at this point. And really what I'm thinking at this point, I need this to read in a super logical way where I'm not breaking any type of discussion. I need that thread, the logical thread of somebody following this to be very direct. So here's what I elected to do. Instead of dealing with that in those technical terms, I just said he's just asking for written confirmation. So here, I just say Sam's request for written confirmation, which corresponds to here. Sam did it. He wanted written confirmation. Now I'm going to deal with it in terms of what needs to happen in order for that. And I'm even going to type the confirmation as a condition and explain what the effect of that condition is. I did think of breaking that up, but for the sake of time, I had to combine it. I think it makes the analysis dirtier. That is, it's harder to follow logically. But since it's a small portion of a much larger argument, I didn't think it made sense to break it up anymore. So let's go ahead and continue. Under the common law, a contract cannot be modified unless there is new consideration given for the contract modification. This is not a common law contract. I always establish the common law rule and then I modify it for the UCC. However, under the UCC, a contract can be modified as long as the parties modify it in good faith. So now I need to establish that they're working in good faith. So how do we satisfy that? Again, here we just tag it. He asked for the modification. The other guy said, yes, I will send written confirmation tomorrow. They're acting in good faith. And that's what we have. Here, the agreement had already been formed by the time that Sam added that he wanted the written confirmation to be a condition of sending the maple topping. That would be a condition precedent. The confirmation is a condition that must occur before Sam is obligated to perform by sending the topping. This line we could have left off, and I think it would make for a straighter, more direct analysis. But to save time, it makes sense to just include it in the middle of the paragraph. Say he wants a condition. What is that condition? He wants to add this additional modification. The modification is a condition. What is the condition? Well, he wants a condition precedent before he needs to perform. And now we continue. He said this in good faith, and Brian seemed to agree to it by saying that he would send the confirmation tomorrow. That matches what we see here. Thus, the condition of a written confirmation would likely be seen as binding. They're working in good faith. So here we're dealing with establishing the effect of that condition, the modification together. Again, this could probably be made more clear by spending more time. All we really need to get out of here is the acted in good faith. That's really the bulk of it. The rest of it is just extra stuff that we have to prove that we know the law. Okay, so now we deal with a statute of frauds. We know that they're dealing with 500 gallons, $20 per gallon. So we know that this can go beyond $500 or more. And the way that I always deal with the statute of frauds is we deal with it applicable and then does it satisfy. So we put stuff in the statute and then we take it out if it's satisfied. First, we'll start out with our general rule. To be valid, a certain subset of contracts must satisfy the statute of frauds. Those contracts include marriage contracts, surety contracts, contracts for services that by their terms cannot be performed in less than 1 year, contracts for the sale of real estate, and relevant here, contracts for the sale of goods worth $500 or more. Notice that my rule here is actually not 100% right. It should actually be sell for the goods that are $500 or more. I think because the analysis was well done, they didn't take off any points for that, or at least if they did, I didn't see it. In the next paragraph, we just tag this up here. We find the facts to establish that this is the case. So in this particular case, the contract is for 500 gallons of topping at $20 per gallon. That means that the total value of the contract is 500 times 20, which is 10,000, well over the limit for the statute of frauds to apply. Now we go into whether or not the statute of frauds was satisfied, because if it was not satisfied, then the contract can be voided. So here is where we're going to spend, or at least when I wrote this, this is one of the places that I felt was worth quite a bit in terms of analysis. In order to satisfy the statute of frauds, a contract must typically be in writing with all material terms. Go ahead and get a different color pen. With all material terms in writing. Notice here that the second I said material terms, we haven't established what the material terms are. We did up here, but we haven't really established what it takes to form a contract. So we need to go back and define this over here, but I left it blank because I knew that most of the points were down here. So with all of the material terms and signed by the third party to be charged, so we know that, there are a few exceptions for good contracts, including full or partial performance. Here, partial performance is like a head fake. The reason I say that is because he shipped 500 gallons, which is only partially performed, but it's much, much later in time. So if you're just thinking, oh, he partially performed, and you go for the head fake, you're going to get messed up here. So you need to see that here as far as when they're establishing the oral contract, that's the time that we're going to look at partial performance, not later. Fooled by that. The final exception is a merchant's confirmatory memo, which if sent a reasonable time after the conclusion of the deal and signed by the merchant, can also satisfy the statute of frauds. And this here is also another head fake. So here you got two head fakes. The partial performance is likely what some people are going to see when they see that 500. And they're going to see this purchase order coming in later as being one possibility is to see it as a confirmatory memo. Remember that between merchants, it is possible that you have an oral agreement and then one of the parties can follow up with a confirmatory memo, as long as it has their letterhead, their terms are the same, that thing. If that happens, you have satisfied the statute of frauds. So I got the feeling that they were expecting me to go for that. I was like, nope, it ain't going to happen. Nope. So again, now we'll continue. Now what we do is, just as we've done with everything else, for each of these material terms, full or partial performance, and confirmatory memo, so all three of those, now what we're going to do is we are going to deal with them one at a time. Material terms and writing, full or partial performance. Let's do that in a different color, maybe a blue. And next we are going to deal with confirmatory memo. We have 1, 2, 3 things to talk about. Let's do that, and I'll do it in the same colors. There was no contract in writing at the time of the agreement, and there is no indication that Brian and Sam fully or partially performed on the contract until much later, at least 7 weeks after the oral agreement and 3 weeks after Brian's purchase order. This here goes with this. There is no full, we said that you can satisfy with full or partial performance. That is not there. Thus, that does not satisfy the statute of frauds. Now comes the big one, the confirmatory memo. And for that, we could have put it here, but it's its own, got a lot more facts to it. So that's why we have it its own paragraph. Here, this red is going to be what we're going to discuss here to here. Let's go over that. I know that the red is harder to see. I'm going to highlight this yellow as we go through. This here goes with that red up there. Brian may try to argue that the purchase order 3 weeks later constituted a merchant's confirmatory memo. That makes sense. As noted, Brian is a merchant and the contract is between merchants. This establishes why Brian would think that he could do that. However, there are a few problems. First, the memo was not sent a reasonable time after the deal was agreed to. Brian said that he would send it tomorrow, but instead he sent it 3 weeks later. It's not a reasonable time. Thus, it cannot make the oral agreement satisfy the statute of frauds. Second, now we have a second reason why it's not going to work. Second, the memo did not contain the same terms as the oral agreement. Here, when we're talking about the memo did not contain the same terms, this here, go ahead and use a different color, maybe purple, has to match, or have to now establish that it does in fact have different terms. So what are the terms? Well, there's the terms for the purchase order, but those are being compared to the terms that we have here in the oral agreement. So the terms that are here are going to now be compared down here. Remember that that confirmatory memo has it needs to have the same terms as the oral deal. You can't come to my house, we have a conversation, I promise to sell you my car for $500, and then you go home and I send you a memo selling it to you for $5 million. That doesn't work. It has to have the same terms. So here, now we go exactly over that and we detail that in very precise details. Second, the memo did not contain the same terms. One, it provided for the shipment to be delivered to Brian's place of business, where the oral contract was for a shipment contract. This may not be a material term, but it shows the difference. So here, this I could have left out. And really what I meant here is not one of the minimum UCC non-gap fillable terms. They didn't take off points for that. Two, the writing provided for the topping to be shipped 2 weeks from the date. From that date, 5 weeks after the initial shipment would have been provided. So here there's a difference in the shipping. And three, it had different quantity term, 5,000 instead of 500. And quantity is always a significant material term when it comes to a goods contract, because that's what the UCC says. This right here, I would say, out of everything that we have in this essay, is probably one of the areas that you have the most points to get in. And the reason for that is because you have to bring in lots of different facts to make plausible, convincing argument. It's not just, oh, Statute of Frauds was satisfied. No, it wasn't. You have to say, it's not satisfied. He's going to argue this, but it's not. Also notice that I didn't waste a whole lot of time with saying Sam is going to say that it was satisfied, but Brian's not going to say that it was satisfied, and all of those things. That just wastes time. Instead, just say, here's the issue. One of the parties is going to make this argument, and that argument is going to fail. And just objectively say why it's going to fail. Don't go back and forth and then try to adjudicate the issue. I guess you could if you have nothing better to do with your time. I'm a slow test taker. I don't have time for that. Thus, the memo cannot operate as a confirmation and bring the oral agreement into compliance with the Statute of Frauds. The oral agreement is thus invalid, and the memo will operate instead as an offer or an invitation to deal in a new bargaining process. So here we conclude as to what is the significance. What does it failing the Statute of Frauds do? It makes that oral agreement unenforceable because it didn't satisfy the Statute of Frauds. It can be invalidated by one of the parties. Next, we now deal with the purchase order. The purchase order, we know, is placing an order for the maple topping. It has on it what the subject matter is, the number of quantity. We know that it becomes an offer. We don't have to restate it. We can just say, see rule for offer. Now notice I said see rule for offer, but I haven't defined offer yet. Even though I wrote this down here, I knew that I had to go back and fill this in. Otherwise, I'm going to have a problem. It's like I'm referencing something that doesn't exist. But again, this over here, we still know that it's missing. It's not forgotten. It's just a matter of holding that information in the back of our head, right? Now we go through and detail what the purchase order is going to, how does it operate within the setting. The purchase order can be understood as a new offer to Sam to enter into a contract for the sale of topping. The signed purchase order stated the material terms. So now we need to establish, we have a definition for offer, but we need to establish that this is an offer, right? So it needs to have the subject matter, it needs to have quantity, at least those two things, right? The parties, right? Parties obviously detailed by one sending it by Sam or Brian. Those are our parties. We know, and they're exchanging this communication that's done. But it needs to at least have what the subject matter is, which is the maple topping and the quantity. So now we detailed that very explicitly. The signed order stated the material terms, quantity, and a number of new terms. So here we indicate that there's going to be some new terms coming in. It's not going to be the same as before. Here I decided to go with what the impact of the offer is, which is to create in Sam the power of acceptance by agreeing to those terms and create a validly binding contract. This paragraph here, I could have left off. I looked at the time when I was writing this and I had enough time so far because I'm always kind of looking at the clock, and I thought I could see somebody saying, well, maybe it's a persistent offer that's there as opposed to automatically being a counter offer, right? And really what I'm trying to do at this point in terms of my internal process, I look at it like when I'm writing this, what I want to convince that person that's reading this is that the diagnostic process that I'm using, the flow charts in my head, are valid. So even though if there's something that has 5 or 6 different choices, I will go ahead and obviously always select the right. I will state a very clear rule and I will select the right one, but I will also show the impact of what if you went down the wrong path, right? So if somebody said, hey, should I go drinking and driving, right? I guess I could say no, right? But I might say you could, but that would be bad for X reason. You might hurt somebody, you're going to kill somebody, you're going to hurt yourself. Other reason is it's going to hurt you. We're going to go ahead and then let's not do this because of these other reasons, right? So with that said, here I'm also exploring if we go down that second path. And that is, what if it is this standing offer, but then I'm going to quickly discount it. Boom. So no more than a paragraph. And I'll do that a few times over, right? So the purchase order could also be understood as an acceptance. So if you had not invalidated the previous oral offer, you could look at the purchase order being a confirmatory memo. And in that case, it would be an acceptance, right? That's not the case, but it could have been. And that is if the initial oral conversation is seen as an offer that remained on the table. So I am exploring that. And then I quickly discount it. However, offers can terminate after a reasonable passage of time, since the contract was for immediate shipment of goods and there was a promise to send a written confirmation the next day. Thus, by the time 2 weeks had passed, it was no longer reasonable to accept the offer and the offer had terminated. I'm making it clear to the grader that I do understand that there was a different possibility here, but it didn't take me long going down that route to realize that's the wrong route to take. The right route is that there's a new offer, and now we're going to accept it with a signed acknowledgement. So here, signed acknowledgement is going to be an acceptance. And here, pretty quick, Sam's acknowledgement constituted an acceptance of the offer from Brian that was contained in the purchase order. I say, again, I'm precise as to what he's accepting. And this was Sam's confirmatory memo, right? So when he sent that, now we have this new offer, the purchase order, the signed acknowledgement, which is the acceptance. And clearly that's going to be $500 or more. So now we once again need to hit the statute of frauds. We don't need to put it back in the statute and back out. That would take too long. So we can just go to just do the analysis. So here, the contract is now confirmed by Sam's written signed acknowledgement, signed by the party to be charged in the action of question 2, so basically Sam. So the statute of frauds is satisfied. Additionally, the statute of frauds can be satisfied by partial performance, but only for the amount already performed. After Sam sent 500 gallons of maple topping, that would be enough to satisfy the statute of frauds for that amount only. Well, now, why did I do this? Why did here, I've already satisfied the statute of frauds with a confirmatory memo. Why did I do this here? Well, if we go back to our discussion of the statute of frauds, you could do it, you could satisfy it by full or partial performance by writing, if it was done by the party to be charged. It could also be done by full or partial performance or with a confirmatory memo, right? Here, I'm dealing with both of those separate. Coming back over here, I'm dealing with both of those. I did change the order, but I figured enough time had passed since the reader had read this, that he didn't need to think, well, the order over here was full partial performance and then confirmatory memo. Instead here, I started with confirmatory memo because that's the one that really counts for us. We'd also hit partial performance, and the reason for that was in recognition that he had already sent the 500 gallons. So that's the statute of frauds has been satisfied as to those 500 gallons, and that's why we deal with that there. Sam had shipped 500 gallons, so that's where we get that from, right? Now we have to deal with the fact that when he got the purchase order, he didn't notice a whole lot of things. He didn't look at the change in gallonage, the delivery date. So there are differences between what the purchase order says, what he's acknowledging to, but what Sam is acknowledging to, but what he sends back restates what he meant in the purchase order, but then he behaved according to his subjective belief. So there we have a few issues. Since he's acting on his subjective belief, we need to write something up on objective manifestations we talked about before. That is his outward actions that count. In terms of the acceptance, we need to talk about how that acceptance here is still valid, even though it has different terms. Again, I tend to always state the common law and then UCC is how it changes it. And that's exactly what I do here. So you'll notice that this right here is mostly a 2207 issue, but I didn't state it that way. I just said mirror image rule versus UCC. And my 2207 explanation, I try to do it very conversational as opposed to just plotting down the memorized chunk that we get from our books. And I think that makes it for stronger analysis because it makes it clear that you understand what's going on within the context of the fact pattern. So here we go. At common law, when an acceptance contained terms that were different from the offer, there was no contract. They had to be the mirror image of one another. However, the UCC is more forgiving of conflicting terms, which is what applies here. And now we basically state 2207 in a very conversational way. When an offer and an acceptance contain different terms, the court will find that there was still a contract and it will just knock out the conflicting terms and gap fill them. Moreover, if the acceptance contains additional terms to the offer, those terms will generally enter the contract unless the offer was conditional on no additional terms being added or the additional terms go to the basis of the bargain. So that's essentially 2207. And now we then apply this to our facts. You notice here, the application to the facts is almost just tagging, right? And when I say tagging, I just mean you find the facts and almost rephrase them in the synonyms. It's not like we have to do a whole lot of interpretation in the analysis, right? As opposed to up here where we have to bring in lots of facts from different places to do our analysis. Let's do that. If the initial agreement is understood as an offer and Brian's memo is understood as the acceptance, then there cannot be a contract because there was no agreement on key terms. That is the quantity term. Remember that on UCC, the quantity is always required. However, if there were a contract, then the terms of the acceptance would govern because the offer was not made conditional on no additional terms. If the initial agreement is not a valid contract nor a valid persisting offer, as discussed above, the valid persisting offer is what we discussed sitting over here. This is our valid persisting offer, right? Then the purchase order was his own offer. Sam's signed acknowledgement constituted as an acceptance because it was sent to Sam, and then here we state why. It was sent to Sam. We restated the items in Brian's offer, including the new price term. Thus, there are no indications on conflicting or additional terms. Thus, the purchase order terms govern. By the time we get here, we have already answered the question. We've basically said that there is a contract, and we have identified the terms, which is what it's asking for, the terms and whether or not there's a contract, right? So that has been done. However, if we do that, we're going to get a pretty low grade because there's still a lot to discuss, and that is Sam reads a different date, but then he ignores it. There's a whole lot of things that are going on that now we need to address in terms of what Sam was thinking and does that belong in a contractual relationship. And here, I started to look at the clock and I thought to myself, I'm starting to feel a little bit behind. This discussion took longer than it should have. Here, what I'm going to do is go directly to the analysis and interweave into my analysis the issues that are relevant. And because all of the rules that I'm going to be using in here have been previously stated, there really is not, or at least no points were taken off that I noticed. Here we go. Sam argued that he did not know that the contract was for $5,000, and so there was no meeting of the mind on the quantity term. There can be no UCC contract. He did not notice a change in gallonage, which suggests that he was still thinking about the oral contract from 2 weeks prior. However, mutual assent is based on the outward manifestation of assent. Here, I did throw the rule in. but I did it in context, not the inward thoughts of the parties. Sam received a purchase order for 5,000 gallons, and he sent a note acknowledging the same quantity term, repeating it. Here's the nail in his coffin. Dude, I sent you an order for 5,000. You sent me back an acknowledgement for 5,000. You can't now say that the quantity term was not specified, that it wasn't particularized. Moreover, he should have noticed that many other terms were changed, as described above. That would have put a reasonable person on notice about the changed quantity term. Thus, there was mutual assent. The same is true of the delivery date. Despite not personally believing that it was a firm date, Sam still repeated it in his signed acknowledgement, which is an objective manifestation of his intent to be bound to the terms. Here, our conclusion is he objectively manifested to be bound, and that's what we're going to do, right? Now, this right here, I originally left off, and we're going to come back to that. However, Sam could try to argue mistake as defenses to formation. I left that off because I didn't know if I would have enough time to talk about these defenses, but I did have this in there. Thus, the terms of the contract are for the provision of 5,000 gallons of maple syrup at $20 a gallon to be delivered to Brian's place of business in 2 weeks. So if there was a one-line conclusion to this question, it would be this, right? And you can tell that I did that's what I did, that I added this after the fact, because generally I don't have the conclusion to my essay buried. Normally this would be way down here. So I was only going to come back to here if I had extra time. So once I get done with this, boom, that's basically where I ended. This right here was not there. So I am going to highlight this red so you can see the parts I added once I had extra time. Okay, so at that point, we are done with question number 1, only coming back if we have some extra time. Now we go to question number 2. Is Brian likely to prevail on his claim against Sam? If so, what damages is he likely to recover? This question from your remedies class should be one that doesn't have all of the trickiness of the previous one. I think this is I felt like this one was provided to give you a break from the very drawn out issues that came before. At first, you establish that there was a contract. And in my case, I just says, see above regarding the formation of the contract and contract terms. I'm referencing this contract formation. I better not forget it up there. So right now, the way it is, I'm saying reference this contract formation. The contract formation says presume there's a contract. Very bad analysis, but that's still kind of filed back there. Next, we need to establish breach. And then we need to establish damages. And anytime that we talk about damages, we always talk about duty to mitigate. And then we just start from the top. This one's pretty straightforward. For breach, we say under the UCC, a seller has an obligation of perfect tender. We then indicate what does perfect tender means. It means you need to deliver perfect goods and perfect delivery. I could have done something like under the UCC, the seller has an obligation of delivering perfect goods and perfect delivery. However, that would miss the opportunity to use perfect tender, which is a term of art for us. We want to make sure that we include that in there so that we sound like we know what we're talking about. And now comes our analysis. Rule very little. Our analysis saying, let's go through it. The goods were not perfect because, as discussed, the contract was for the shipping of 5,000 gallons of maple topping instead of 500 gallons. That's why it wasn't perfect. You shipped the wrong amount. We know that for installment contracts, there's slightly different rules. You can mess up some of the shipments and still be okay, as long as the overall contract is okay. I didn't want to get any of the details into that. It really is not relevant here. Very quickly, just make sure we know that, but we quickly discount it. This was not an installment contract, so special rules for partial performance do not apply. And at the time for delivery has already passed. Thus, there is no opportunity to cure owed to Sam. Thus, Brian is entitled to reject the maple syrup and sue for breach as he did. Now we deal with it a little bit more in terms of some of the things that Sam might come up with, but we always are going to discount them because it's pretty clear in this case. There was also not perfect delivery. So here we're dealing, if you look at here, I'm saying this requires perfect goods and it also requires perfect delivery. So down here, I am dealing with the perfect goods. The goods were not perfect. And down here, I'm dealing with the fact that the delivery was not perfect. I know we talked about that. The maple topping was delivered 2 weeks late. There was no time of the essence clause. So we deal with the fact that under UCC, if there's no time of the essence clause, what is the impact of that? We quickly discount how that's relevant here, but that does not excuse late performance under the UCC where a delivery date is specified. And this is just not a little bit late. It was double the time given, which is a big deal. There is an exception. Sam could say, I thought that I was sending you conforming goods. And here we make it a very clear distinction that sending non-conforming goods would apply to like something like I was supposed to send you red rubber duckies and I sent you green ones. But that's not what's going on here. Instead, he's sending the wrong amount. And he's sending it at the wrong time. He's not delivering non-conforming goods in that way. So we discount that as well. There is an exception for imperfect tender for non-conforming goods where the seller has a reason to believe that the buyer would accept the replacement goods. So we put the rule in there. And Sam may say that the delay with the writing follow-up, he thought that Brian would accept late delivery. But, and then we discount that. But this is late delivery, not imperfect goods. So that exception does not apply. Thus, Brian is entitled to reject the maple syrup and sue for breach. So once again, we lay that down and we basically say that Brian is likely to succeed on the lawsuit, which is correct based on these facts. Now, in terms of damages, which is what's asking us, right? Now, what damages is he likely to recover? We just do your standard damages analysis. We know that we need to talk about expectation damages, incidental damages, consequential damages. There was no liquidated damages clause here, so we can just do all of those very quickly. 5 minutes at most, maybe 6, 7. We start out with a standard rule. The standard form of a contract damages is expectation damages. Expectation damages are designed to make the non-breaching party in the same position that they would have been in had the contract been performed according to the terms. This is typically calculated between the contract term and the covered price, but it might also be the difference between the contract price and the market price. However, Brian was not able to cover as he was unable to find replacement goods. Here's basically what expectation damages are, but he was not able to cover because he was not able to find alternates. Next, incidental damages. You'll notice here I made a mistake and they did not take off points for, at least if they did. I started with consequential damages. This should actually be incidental damages. But then if you read the rest of this, it goes with incidental damages. Consequential damages are costs incurred while trying to remedy the breach. Brian spent time and effort trying to contact Sam while he was away and trying to find a new supply of maple syrup. He could receive those damages. We established that Brian spent time and effort. He should be compensated for that. Phone calls he made, his own time, places he drove trying to find whatever those little tiny damages are, he should be compensated for that. Next comes a larger discussion. And here this is triggered by the fact that there's this very large lucrative contract that is dependent on having the maple topping available. It results in $100,000 of lost profits and how that impacts the equation. Here we just do the standard consequential damages analysis, which basically if it was not foreseeable, if it wasn't something within the contemplation of the parties at the time of contracting, then they're not going to be able to get them. I do that again conversationally. Consequential damages are those other than expectation damages that are caused by the breach. Here Sam lost out on a $100,000 profit on the catering contract, and he did so because he could not provide the pastries with the maple topping. However, there are limitations on consequential damages. So up to here, I make it sound like, hey, yeah, he lost that money because that maple topping wasn't there. He might be able to get that. But then I quickly put on the brakes. However, there are some limitations. The damages must be foreseeable at the time of the contract, either as a natural and probable consequence of the breach, or discussed by the parties at the time of contracting. Then we apply it to the facts. It is reasonably foreseeable that Brian would lose some business if not able to sell maple topping pastries, since he runs a commercial bakery, which makes sense, right? You have a commercial bakery. I ordered this ingredient that I need to sell stuff and you don't sell it to me. It's reasonable I'm going to lose some business. However, Sam was not aware of this large lucrative contract. Now, Dan may argue that the 5,000 term plus the 2 weeks made it foreseeable that he wanted to sell a large number of baked goods. That's not that there's an immediate demand for them in the contract. Brian may argue that the 5,000 term plus the 2 weeks made it foreseeable that there was a big contract on the horizon. However, it only really makes it foreseeable that he wants to sell a large number of baked goods, not that there's going to be an immediate demand for them in the contract that might get canceled if he's in default in a matter of weeks. Thus, Dan can likely make some of the lost profits for his inability to meet his standard demand for the goods that he sells, but he will not be able to get the full $100,000 of this big lucrative contract because that was not discussed. It's not foreseeable, right? Finally, we talked about whether or not there's a duty to mitigate, and that's pretty straightforward, right? Brian tried but was unsuccessful in obtaining an alternate source of maple topping. Sam satisfied his duty to mitigate by his efforts to find an alternate supplier. I used the time that was left over to then come back and deal with these parts. The very first one that I dealt with was here. So from here, I knew that I had only a few facts about the formation of this contract, and I could just say it was stipulated. But I still needed more, right? I still wanted more than what I currently have. So the way that I dealt with it was I very selectively used the definitions for the individual parts of a contract. And here, you'll see kind of what I mean. I said, a contract is a legal enforceable promise. Makes sense. A contract requires offers, acceptance, and consideration. Okay. An offer is an expression of present intent to enter a contract that creates in the offeree the power of acceptance. Notice this definition, I don't have to now go into, at least the definition that I typically use for offer is an offer is a manifestation of contractual intent communicated to the offeree with certain indefinite terms. If I do that, then I have each of those elements to establish. I don't have time for that. So instead, I just said an offer is an expression of present intent to enter into a contract that creates the standard power of acceptance. The offer must generally contain the material terms of the contract. Under the UCC, the material terms are the parties, the quantity, and the goods. And the UCC is able to gap fill the rest of them using UCC defaults. And then I indicate this is different in the common law where price is a term that has to be specified. An acceptance must follow the terms supplied by the offer, and it must be communicated to the offeror. Or consideration is the requirements that a contract be a bargain for exchange in which both parties alter their legal position. Notice here, I was also selective in my definition. I didn't sit there and say consideration requires legal detriment and mutual inducement. I just said it is just changing their legal position. Nor did I say consideration is one party doing something that he wasn't obligated to do or refraining to do something that he had a right to do. I could have done it that way too, but I decided to instead pick this definition because this definition is good enough for the facts that we have and it's much shorter. With that said, then I added this line here where I talk about, hey, there are these terms that we know. However, Sam could probably in vain, I didn't say in vain, but based on the analysis I had already done when I started to write this, definitely in vain, he can likely try to assert unilateral or mutual mistake. Just to make it clear, I was going to discuss that. I said see below. Again, I should have probably had this at the end of the defenses. That's a little bit more standard. But again, here I'm down to just the last few minutes. Basically, as the bell was going off, as they say, well, there was no bell. This was question 5. So really it was me looking at the clock thinking I need to get over and start working on the performance test. I didn't want to go take time away from that. So anyhow, with that said, then I decided to talk about defenses. And here basically about the only defenses I could think about that he could say, well, he said 5,000 gallons. I said 500 gallons, or he said 5,000. I said 5,000. We're mistaken as to the number of gallons. So I needed to very quickly go through that, but meticulously make it clear that there is no mistake here. So there we go. So we start out with defenses. However, a contract that is otherwise valid may be deemed not to be validly formed if a defense applies. The defenses are mistake, misrepresentation, incapacity, and statute of frauds. That actually is not a 100% true statement. There are other formation defenses, stuff like duress, et cetera. There's quite a few more. But those were the ones that I could think about kind of as I was getting towards the end. So it was a little bit frantic on my end. And then really, I concentrated on mistakes. So I discounted the other two. There are no facts indicating incapacity or misrepresentation. And instead, we've already talked about statute of frauds, so we're going to consider a mistake. A mutual mistake happens when both parties are mistaken regarding a key term in the contract. They can seek judicial reformation of the contract to reflect their true intentions. And then I established that really, for a mutual mistake, they both have to be mistaken as to material terms. So now I established that we're not mistaken. They were very deliberate in what they were doing. But it does not seem like Brian was mistaken. He sent the purchase order form after spending 3 weeks negotiating a contract for a big catering deal that required large quantities of topping. Thus, it seemed like he intended for the purchase order to have 5,000. He wasn't mistaken about that material term. That's what he wanted. It seemed that Sam was mistaken since he did not notice that it had the change, then did ship only 500 gallons. There was no mutual mistake. A similar analysis applies to the delivered date. It also seems likely that Brian intended the date. That is, he spent the same amount of time. The analysis would be the same in light of his new contract. However, Sam has even less of a case for being mistaken about this term because he actually saw it and recognized it. He just did not think that it mattered. Here it goes. He saw the delivery date, but he did not believe that it was firm. So he saw it and he was like, that's not serious. So he can't say I was mistaken. He knew about it. There was no mistake there. Next, we deal about it. Then anytime we talk about mistake, we also talk about unilateral mistake. And here, all we're basically saying that, let's just go through it. A contract may be rescinded for unilateral mistake where one party is mistaken about a key term in the contract that goes to the basis of the bargain, and the other party either knew of the mistake and failed to correct it or caused the mistake, where the mistaken party is not responsible for the mistake. Sam may try to argue that Brian caused the mistake because he represented that it was for 500 gallons, then delayed sending the confirmation and increased the price point without calling sufficient attention to it. But Brian did not have reason to know that Sam did not process the increase in gallonage, or that Sam would infer from the prior conversation that all of the terms were the same. Ultimately, it was Sam's responsibility to read the contract and to process the terms when he repeated them in the acknowledgement. That right there. He was not mistaken unilaterally, and it wasn't caused by the other party. Thus, the contract is not voidable for unilateral mistake. Similarly, by not following up with Brian about the date and confirming it despite having no intention of meeting it, that's just bad faith, sort of, or at least carelessness, negligence. That mistake was also Sam's fault, and he cannot void the contract on that basis. And that was basically it. That's how I did question number 5 on the California bar exam in February 2024. If you have any questions, please let me know, and I will gladly try to answer those. Hopefully this was of some value. I tried to concentrate more on my strategy, what I minimize, maximize, where I spend time, choices that I made during the exam, rather than substantive law. I think that usually people review the substantive part of the law really well for the bar exam, and you get lots of practice doing that. But what I've seen a little bit less of is people telling you, these are the choices that I made during this part of the exam. That's why I did them. And it had this effect on the exam, right? So for example, places where I spent more time so that I could go into greater depth, and places where I spent less time, or places where I picked weaker definitions, or at least less precise definitions, to save myself time, right? So all of those things do contribute on your ability to deliver a good exam. So anyhow, hopefully this was of some use. I do apologize if I stumbled upon my words here and there. It was nice hanging out.